The communication array in the Zorian High Command pulsed with an angry crimson glow, a color reserved for only the most critical of transmissions. Commander Vexera's neural implants processed the incoming data stream with clinical precision, each holographic fragment revealing another layer of the catastrophic situation on Krell Prime. 317 standard rotations. That was how long the insurgency had defied the might of the Zorian Confederation. Entire battalions had been ground to dust against the planet's unforgiving terrain and the insurgents' stubborn resistance. The mineral-rich world was bleeding the Confederation dry, not just in resources, but in political capital and military prestige. Vexera's six-fingered hands manipulated the holographic display, zooming into satellite imagery that told a story of systematic failure. Krell Prime was a nightmare of geological complexity, a planet of deep ravines, electromagnetic anomalies, and terrain that shifted like a living organism. Traditional military doctrine had failed spectacularly here. The preliminary reports from the diplomatic corps suggested a radical solution. Humans, mercenaries, a species so new to interstellar conflict that most senior Zorian commanders viewed them as little more than an amusing footnote in galactic history. Transmitting final contract parameters, announced diplomatic attaché Clindara, her translation matrix rendering the words with bureaucratic precision. Blue Horizon Solutions has accepted the terms. Vexera's secondary visual receptors narrowed. The contract was unprecedented. Complete operational autonomy in exchange for a fixed price and a guaranteed resource allocation. No Zorian commander would ever agree to such terms. But then again, they were out of options. The personnel file for Captain Alina Rodriguez materialized in his neural feed. Redacted sections dominated the document, a clear indication of compartmentalized information. Her service record was a mosaic of impossible missions and strategic interventions that defied conventional military understanding. Born in the sprawling megacity of Sao Paulo on Earth, Rodriguez represented a generation of human warriors forged in the crucible of climate wars and territorial conflicts. Her early career included peacekeeping operations in the South American reclamation zones, followed by classified engagements in the lunar corporate conflicts. Each mission painted a picture of someone who didn't just fight wars. She fundamentally reimagined how they were conducted. A notification pinged. The first Blue Horizon dropships were preparing for trans-atmospheric insertion. Vexera accessed the live feed, watching as the human vessels approached Krell Prime. They moved differently from Zorian craft, less mechanically precise, more adaptive, like predators sensing terrain rather than simply navigating it. The financial implications were staggering. Blue Horizon's contract represented a fraction of the cost of a full Zorian military intervention. But cost was the least interesting aspect of this gambit. Deep in the Zorian High Command's most secure archives, classified reports hinted at something more. Humanity's rapid technological advancement, their capacity for innovation, their ability to turn seemingly insurmountable challenges into opportunities. These were the real reasons for selecting human mercenaries. Flindera's voice cut through Vexera's contemplation. Preliminary insertion begins in 17 standard minutes. Blue Horizon leadership requests minimal initial interference. Minimal interference. The phrase itself was a calculated risk. Every military protocol Vexera had been trained and screamed against such autonomy. And yet, here they were, desperate enough to unleash an unknown quantity into a conflict that had already consumed their best strategies. As the first human dropships penetrated Krell Prime's turbulent atmosphere, Vexera couldn't shake a growing sense of anticipation. This was more than a military contract. This was a potential paradigm shift. Something fundamental was about to change. And the Zorian Confederation was about to discover that hiring humans was far more than a simple mercenary transaction. The real question was not whether they could win the conflict, but what unexpected consequences would emerge from introducing humanity into this delicate galactic equation. The moment Captain Alina Rodriguez's boots touched Krell Prime's surface, she knew this was no ordinary battlefield. The planet itself seemed to breathe. a living, malevolent entity that had already consumed countless military expeditions. Her tactical overlay flickered with 1,000 data points, each one a potential threat. The electromagnetic interference was unlike anything in her previous combat experiences. Standard communication protocols became useless within moments of planetfall, forcing her team to rely on a custom-built quantum entanglement communication system developed during the lunar corporate conflicts. "Ghost Squad, sound off," Rodriguez commanded, her voice steady despite the howling winds that carried traces of ionized mineral particles. One by one, her team checked in. Not soldiers in the traditional sense, but a carefully curated collection of specialists. Dr. Marcus Chen, their embedded xenotech analyst, had spent years studying unconventional warfare. Sergeant Aisha Nyong'o, a biomechanical warfare expert who had redesigned their combat suits to interact dynamically with Krell Prime's unpredictable environment. Lieutenant Diego Ramirez, a psychological warfare specialist whose skills blurred the line between military intelligence and pure psychological manipulation. The insurgent stronghold wasn't a fixed location. It was a living network that spread like a neural system across the planet's fractured terrain. Traditional reconnaissance was suicide. Instead, Rodriguez deployed a swarm of microscopic reconnaissance drones that looked more like metallic dust than technology. Chen, analysis. She spoke into her neural comm. Dr. Chen's holographic projection materialized, a translucent blue figure overlaying the rocky landscape. The insurgency isn't just a military movement. It's an ecosystem. They've adapted to Krell Prime at a molecular level. Their communication networks are integrated with the planet's unique electromagnetic properties. Rodriguez's augmented vision zoomed into a topographical map that looked more like a biological system than a geographical representation. The insurgents had transformed the very landscape into a defensive mechanism. Mineral-rich rock formations could become instant fortifications. Electromagnetic anomalies could disable technological systems in milliseconds. "They're not fighting a war," Ramirez interjected, his analysis streaming directly into Rodriguez's neural feed. "They're conducting a planetary immune response. We're the infection." The first engagement wasn't a battle in any traditional sense. It was a complex dance of technological adaptation and environmental manipulation. Rodriguez's team didn't approach the insurgent positions. They became part of the landscape. Sergeant Nyong'o's biomechanical suit began to shift, its molecular structure realigning to match the mineral composition of the surrounding terrain. Camouflage was an outdated concept. This was true environmental integration. The insurgents' early warning systems, sophisticated networks that had defeated multiple Zorian military interventions, suddenly went dark. Not through destruction, but through a kind of technological dissonance that Chen's systems created. It was less an attack, and more a form of sophisticated technological gaslighting. When the first kinetic strikes came, they weren't from traditional weapons. Rodriguez's team used the planet's own geological features as weapons. Carefully calculated sonic frequencies triggered localized mineral shifts, creating instant landslides that consumed insurgent defensive positions. Primary objective, Rodriguez communicated to her team, is not elimination. It's disruption of their systemic cohesion. Each movement was a calculated risk. Each decision was a complex algorithm that considered not just immediate tactical advantages, but long-term strategic implications. The human team wasn't just fighting a war. They were conducting a comprehensive systems analysis of conflict itself. The Zorian observers watching the live feed couldn't comprehend what they were seeing. This wasn't warfare. This was something else entirely. A fluid, dynamic interaction with an environment that most species would consider hostile. By the mission's first rotation, the insurgents had lost over 60% of their communication infrastructure, not through direct destruction, but through a complex manipulation of their technological and environmental systems. They hadn't been defeated. They had been fundamentally destabilized. Rodriguez watched the holographic data streams, her augmented eyes tracking 1,000 variables simultaneously. This was more than a military engagement. This was a first contact scenario, not with an alien species, but with a completely different approach to conflict itself. The real war was just beginning, and Krell Prime would never be the same. The underground research facility hummed with an intensity that bordered on sentience. Dr. Marcus Chen moved between holographic displays, his fingers dancing across quantum interfaces that seemed to breathe and pulse with living information. What had begun as a military mission was rapidly transforming into something far more profound. "We're not just repurposing technology," Chen muttered to himself. "We're teaching it to think." The Zorian communication arrays they'd captured during the initial engagement were no longer recognizable. Where once stood intricate alien tech now existed a hybrid system that blurred the lines between biological adaptation and technological innovation. Chen had discovered something unexpected. The communication systems of Krell Prime contained trace quantum entanglement properties that no previous research had documented. Sergeant Aisha Nyong'o entered the makeshift lab, her biomechanical suit partially disassembled and reconnected to a series of diagnostic systems. "You're going to want to see this," she called out, her voice carrying a mix of scientific excitement and tactical urgency. The display showed something that defied conventional understanding. The insurgent communication network wasn't just a technological system. It was a living ecosystem. Each node adapted, learned, and responded to environmental stimuli in ways that resembled organic neural networks more than traditional communication infrastructure. Rodriguez watched from the command interface, her augmented vision processing multiple layers of data simultaneously. The mission parameters had subtly shifted. What began as a military intervention was becoming a comprehensive study of adaptive systems. "We're not just fighting a war," she communicated to her team. "We're conducting the most extensive xenotechnological research in galactic history." Lieutenant Ramirez's psychological warfare algorithms began to take on a life of their own. They weren't just disrupting insurgent communications, they were learning from them. Each interaction became a complex dance of information, with human-developed systems gradually understanding and then anticipating the insurgency's communication patterns. The first true breakthrough came unexpectedly. Chen discovered that the mineral composition of Krell Prime contained quantum-locked information storage capabilities far beyond any known technological system. The planet itself was a massive, dormant computational matrix. "It's like the entire planet is a computer that's been sleeping," Chen explained, his holographic model spinning complex geometric patterns. "The insurgents haven't been fighting the conventional war. They've been trying to wake something up." Rodriguez's tactical assessment took on a new dimension. This was no longer about military intervention. They were standing on the precipice of a fundamental discovery that could reshape understanding of planetary ecosystems, communication, and technological evolution. The hybrid communication system they developed began to show unexpected capabilities. It could predict insurgent movements with near-perfect accuracy, not through traditional intelligence gathering, but by understanding the fundamental information patterns of the planetary system. Nyong'o's biomechanical research took an unexpected turn. The suit she designed was no longer just protective gear. It was becoming a living interface with Krell Prime's unique electromagnetic environment. Each modification blurred the line between technology and organism. "We're creating something entirely new," Nyong'o reported, her voice a mixture of scientific wonder and tactical precision. "These systems aren't just adapting. They're evolving." The Zorian observers watching the live feed found themselves increasingly bewildered. The human mercenaries were no longer conducting a military intervention. They were performing a kind of technological alchemy that defied all known scientific protocols. Rodriguez understood the deeper implication. This wasn't just about winning a conflict. They were witnessing, and actively participating in, a fundamental transformation of how technology, biology, and planetary systems could interact. As the quantum-linked communication systems reached a critical complexity threshold, something extraordinary began to happen. The boundary between the human intervention team and the planet itself started to dissolve. Krell Prime was waking up, and humanity had become its catalyst. The real mission was just beginning. The encrypted data stream arrived like a ghost, fragmented, encrypted, and laden with a complexity that suggested it was never meant to be fully understood. Rodriguez's neural interface trembled with the implications of what they'd uncovered. Corporate sigils flickered across her retinal display. Not Zorian military insignias, but something far more insidious. The unmistakable markers of the Helios Interstellar Consortium, a transnational corporate entity that made traditional governments look like children playing at diplomacy. "This goes deeper than we thought," Lieutenant Ramirez muttered, his psychological profiling algorithms working overtime to parse the incoming intelligence. The truth emerged in layers. Krell Prime wasn't just a mineral-rich planet. It was a strategic nexus point for a resource more valuable than any known mineral: quantum information storage potential. The insurgency wasn't a rebellion. It was a desperate resistance against a systematic corporate extraction plan that would effectively lobotomize an entire planetary ecosystem. Dr. Chen's holographic models transformed, revealing a terrifying perspective. The planet's unique electromagnetic properties could be weaponized into the most sophisticated data storage and processing system in known galactic history. The Helios Consortium planned to strip mine not just minerals, but the planet's fundamental informational infrastructure. "We're looking at a xenocide," Rodriguez said, her voice flat and clinical. "Not of a species, of an entire planetary consciousness." The moral calculation became impossibly complex. Their original contract with the Zorian Confederation now appeared to be nothing more than a carefully orchestrated corporate manipulation. The Zorians weren't military leaders. They were unwitting proxies in a much larger game. Sergeant Nyong'o's biomechanical interface began to resonate with the planet's deeper information patterns. "The insurgents aren't fighting a war," she reported. "They're performing a preservation protocol. They're protecting something that goes beyond traditional understanding of life and intelligence." Rodriguez faced an impossible decision: complete the contract and become complicit in what amounted to planetary murder, or turn against their employers and risk everything. The human mercenary team had been brought in as a precision instrument of corporate warfare. Instead, they'd become the unexpected immune response to a much larger threat. The Helios Consortium's true plan began to crystallize. Krell Prime wasn't just a resource. It was a potential galactic computational node that could revolutionize information processing. Extracting its capabilities would be equivalent to performing a lobotomy on a living, thinking system. "We're changing the mission parameters," Rodriguez communicated to her team. The quantum encryption of her communication made it effectively unhackable, a technological middle finger to the corporate interests that thought they could control information. Their approach would be surgical, not a direct confrontation, but a comprehensive systems disruption that would expose the Helios Consortium's true intentions to both the Zorian Confederation and the broader galactic community. Ramirez's psychological warfare algorithms began to construct a narrative weapon more powerful than any kinetic strike. They would turn the consortium's own information systems against themselves, creating a cascading exposure of their true intentions. Dr. Chen discovered something even more profound. The insurgents weren't just protecting the planet. They were part of its broader informational ecosystem. Their resistance was a form of planetary immune response, with each fighter connected to Krell Prime's fundamental information network in ways that defied traditional understanding of consciousness. "We're not just intervening," Chen explained, his holographic models spinning complex geometric patterns of interaction. "We're becoming part of a larger systemic response." The corporate sigils began to fragment, their encrypted communications becoming a weapon turned inward. Every attempt to suppress the truth would only accelerate its exposure. Rodriguez understood the deeper game now. This was no longer about a military contract or corporate interests. This was about preserving a form of planetary intelligence that humanity was only beginning to comprehend. As the first waves of corporate communication began to collapse, something extraordinary started to happen. Krell Prime itself seemed to breathe, a massive, complex system awakening to its own potential. The real war was just beginning. and humanity had become its unexpected guardians. Silence became their most potent weapon. Lieutenant Diego Ramirez understood that true psychological warfare wasn't about loud proclamations or dramatic confrontations. It was about creating invisible pressure points that would make entire systems collapse from within. Their first move targeted the Helios Consortium's communication infrastructure, not through direct attacks, but through an infinitely more insidious approach. They began introducing microscopic quantum uncertainties into the corporate communication networks, tiny variations so subtle that they would be imperceptible until they reached critical mass. Information is a living organism, Ramirez explained to Dr. Chen, his fingers dancing across holographic interfaces that looked more like biological networks than technological systems. We're not destroying their communications, we're infecting them with doubt. Each false communication trail was a carefully constructed narrative weapon. Corporate middle managers would receive slightly contradictory intelligence reports. Strategic planning meetings would be subtly disrupted by information that was 99% accurate, but 1% destabilizing. The death of 1,000 microscopic cuts. Meanwhile, Sergeant Nyong'o had discovered something extraordinary about the local population. The insurgents weren't just a military force. They were a distributed intelligence network deeply integrated with Krell Prime's unique electromagnetic ecosystem. Each resistance fighter was both an individual and a node in a much larger informational system. Dr. Chen's quantum analysis revealed the true complexity. They're not communicating like we understand communication, he reported, his holographic model spinning intricate geometric patterns of information flow. It's more like how neurons communicate in a living brain. Each piece of information is simultaneously a message and a transformation. Rodriguez watched the developing strategy with a predator's patience. Their mission had transformed from a military intervention to a complex form of systemic acupuncture, applying precise pressure points to create maximum systemic disruption. The Zorian Confederation observation team watched in increasing bewilderment. The human mercenaries weren't fighting a war. They were conducting something that looked more like a massive, planet-wide improvised performance art piece of strategic manipulation. Ramirez's most brilliant stroke came through what the team internally called narrative injection. They began seeding incredibly nuanced pieces of false information into the Helios Consortium's communication networks. Each piece was crafted with such precision that it would be almost impossible to distinguish from genuine intelligence. Corporate middle managers would receive reports suggesting internal betrayals. Strategic planning meetings would be subtly disrupted by intelligence that was simultaneously compelling and impossible to fully verify. The goal wasn't to create panic. It was to introduce a systemic paralysis of decision-making. We're not destroying their infrastructure, Ramirez explained. We're making it impossible for them to trust their own information systems. The local population began to change. The insurgency transformed from a traditional resistance movement into something far more fluid. Information became a form of collective resistance. Each communication became a potential act of subtle rebellion. Dr. Chen's quantum analysis revealed the deeper strategy. They weren't just disrupting corporate communications. They were helping the planet's indigenous information network develop its own immune response. Rodriguez understood the larger game. This was about creating space for the planet to develop its own systemic response, space for the indigenous population to reclaim their autonomy, space for a different kind of existence to emerge. As the Helios Consortium's communication networks began to fracture, something extraordinary started to happen. The lines between information warfare, ecological preservation, and collective resistance began to blur. They had become more than mercenaries. They were midwives to a planetary transformation. And they were just getting started. The first wave of the rival Galactic Powers intervention fleet arrived like a metal storm. Thousands of vessels that blotted out Krell Prime's twin moons, their weapon signatures charging with enough destructive potential to vaporize entire continents. Captain Rodriguez had anticipated this moment with a calculus that went beyond traditional military strategy. "Activate planetary resonance protocol," she commanded, her voice calm against the backdrop of impending annihilation. What happened next defied every known principle of warfare, planetary defense, and fundamental physics. Dr. Chen's quantum integration systems came alive. The mineral-rich terrain of Krell Prime transformed from a passive battlefield into an active defense mechanism. Electromagnetic fields twisted and warped, creating quantum interference patterns that rendered conventional weapon systems worse than useless. The incoming fleet's advanced targeting systems began to experience cascading failures. Navigation computers produced nonsensical data. Weapon synchronization collapsed into chaos. It wasn't that the weapons were being destroyed. They were being fundamentally misunderstood by the planetary ecosystem. Sergeant Nyong'o's biomechanical interface had become something more than a protective suit. It was now a living translation matrix between the planet's unique energy signatures and the incoming technological assault. Each incoming energy wave was not just detected, but actively reinterpreted, turned into something both familiar and utterly alien. Lieutenant Ramirez worked on a different battlefield, the psychological domain. As the intervention fleet's communication networks began to fracture, he introduced carefully crafted narrative disruptions. Ships began receiving conflicting orders. Command structures dissolved into paranoid miscommunication. The rival power hadn't just underestimated the human mercenaries. They had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the conflict. Krell Prime was fighting back, and the humans were its conductors. Massive geological shifts began to occur, not through traditional tectonic movement, but through quantum-level information manipulation. Entire mountain ranges seemed to breathe and shift, creating defensive configurations that would have been impossible under traditional understanding of planetary physics. "We're not defending," Rodriguez communicated to her team. "We're negotiating." The intervention fleet's second wave arrived with increased technological sophistication. Quantum-locked weapon systems, adaptive AI combat networks, the most advanced military technology in the known galaxy. They lasted less than 17 minutes, not because they were destroyed, but because they were fundamentally transformed. Some vessels found themselves quantum-shifted into alternative geometric configurations. Others discovered their AI systems had been rewritten into complex meditative algorithms that seemed more interested in philosophical contemplation than combat. Dr. Chen's analysis revealed the extraordinary truth. The planet wasn't just defending itself. It was communicating. Each defensive action was a form of dialogue, a complex negotiation with an alien technological ecosystem that had stumbled into its domain. The human team had become something more than mercenaries or even military strategists. They were translators, intermediaries between a planetary intelligence and the destructive potential of galactic conflict. As the last of the intervention fleet's vessels drifted into quantum-locked stasis, Rodriguez understood the deeper victory. This wasn't about winning a battle. This was about creating a new form of interaction. The rival galactic power would spend generations trying to understand what had happened. Their most advanced analysts would produce increasingly complex and ultimately futile explanations. But the truth was simple and profound. They had encountered a form of intelligence so fundamentally different from their understanding that conflict itself became impossible. Krell Prime had not just survived. It had entered into a conversation, and humanity had been its unexpected voice. The negotiation chamber defied conventional understanding. It wasn't a room, but a dynamic space where information flows replaced traditional diplomatic protocols. Representatives from the Zorian Confederation, surviving corporate interests, and local Krell Prime resistance leaders found themselves unable to distinguish between negotiation and fundamental transformation. Captain Rodriguez stood at the epicenter, not as a mediator, but as a translator of impossible complexity. "We're not here to establish peace," she began, her words simultaneously transmitted through quantum communication channels, neural interfaces, and the planet's own electromagnetic resonance. "We're here to create a new form of coexistence." Dr. Chen's computational models projected holographic representations that were part data visualization, part living ecosystem. Each diplomatic proposal didn't just communicate, it evolved in real time. Treaties became living documents that adapted, breathed, and responded to the nuanced interactions of every participant. Lieutenant Ramirez had transformed the psychological warfare techniques into something far more sophisticated. Instead of manipulation, he was facilitating a complex dialogue that allowed each party to see through the perspectives of others. Corporate representatives experienced the lived experiences of local resistance fighters. Zorian military strategists felt the planetary consciousness of Krell Prime. Sergeant Nyong'o's biomechanical interfaces had become something between communication technology and empathy engines. Each participant found themselves connected to a broader systemic understanding that transcended individual perspectives. The Helios Consortium's remaining leadership discovered they were no longer making decisions. They were participating in a collective problem-solving process. Their most advanced predictive algorithms became obsolete, replaced by a form of collaborative intelligence that rendered traditional power structures meaningless. Local resistance leaders who had fought for generations found themselves not triumphant, but humbled. The victory was not about conquest, but about creating a new form of planetary governance that was fundamentally alive. Resource extraction was never the real issue. Rodriguez explained, her words creating ripples of understanding that spread beyond traditional communication boundaries. The problem was a fundamental failure to recognize complexity. The negotiation became a living process of mutual transformation. Krell Prime's unique electromagnetic ecosystem was recognized not as a resource to be exploited, but as a sophisticated information network with its own form of consciousness. Corporate interests found themselves reimagined as custodians rather than extractors. Dr. Chen's most profound contribution was a computational framework that translated ecological preservation into economic opportunity. The planet's informational infrastructure wasn't a resource to be consumed, but a collaborative system that could generate value through symbiosis. Lieutenant Ramirez introduced a governance model that was part diplomatic protocol, part evolutionary algorithm. Decision-making became a dynamic process that could adapt in real time, with each stakeholder contributing to a collectively intelligent system. The Zorian Confederation's representatives found their traditional hierarchical structures dissolving. They were no longer conquering or administering. They were participating in a planetary dialogue that redefined the very concept of governance. Sergeant Nyong'o's interfaces began to reveal the deeper truth. The conflict had never been about resources or territory. It had been a complex misunderstanding, a failure to recognize the fundamental interconnectedness of technological, biological, and informational systems. As the negotiations progressed, something extraordinary happened. The boundaries between negotiation, governance, and living systems began to blur. Corporate charters became adaptive ecological agreements. Military protocols transformed into collaborative preservation strategies. Rodriguez understood the deeper transformation. This was about creating a new model of existence, one that recognized complexity as a form of intelligence, conflict as a process of mutual understanding, and coexistence as a dynamic, evolving system. The final agreement wasn't signed, it was grown. A living document that continued to adapt, to breathe, to respond to the complex interactions of all stakeholders. Krell Prime had not just survived. It had become a blueprint for a fundamentally new way of existing, and humanity had been its unexpected midwife. The debriefing chamber aboard the Blue Horizon headquarters existed in a liminal space between reality and possibility. Holographic displays captured fragments of the Krell Prime intervention, not as a military operation, but as a watershed moment in galactic understanding. Captain Elena Rodriguez stood before a council of interstellar observers, her presentation defying every conventional intelligence report ever produced. "We didn't solve a conflict," she began, her voice carrying the weight of a fundamental revelation. "We demonstrated a new approach to existence." The data streams told a story far beyond military intervention. Krell Prime had become a living case study of systemic transformation. Planetary ecosystems, technological networks, and social structures had merged into something that challenged every existing model of interaction. Dr. Marcus Chen's computational models revealed the deeper truth. The intervention wasn't an isolated incident. It was a proof of concept for a radical new understanding of intelligence, conflict, and coexistence. Diplomatic representatives from 17 different star systems watched in a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. The traditional paradigms of galactic politics, resource extraction, territorial expansion, military dominance, suddenly appeared obsolete. Sergeant Aisha Nyong'o's biomechanical research data told a story of technological symbiosis that defied traditional understanding. The interfaces developed during the Krell Prime intervention weren't just communication tools. They were living bridges between different forms of intelligence. Lieutenant Diego Ramirez's psychological analysis transformed from a military tool into a comprehensive framework for understanding complex systemic interactions. The boundaries between conflict resolution, communication, and collective intelligence had dissolved. The economic implications were staggering. The Helios Consortium's traditional resource extraction models had been completely reimagined. Planetary ecosystems were no longer seen as resources to be consumed, but as collaborative intelligence networks with inherent value. Humanity's unique contribution, Rodriguez explained, her holographic presentation shifting through complex geometric patterns of interaction, is our capacity to recognize complexity as a form of intelligence. The debriefing became something more than a military report. It was a philosophical manifesto. The intervention had revealed a fundamental truth about human potential. Where other species saw boundaries, humans saw interfaces. Where others sought conquest, humans discovered dialogue. Where traditional approaches saw conflict, humans recognized an opportunity for mutual transformation. Chen's computational models demonstrated how the Krell Prime intervention had created a new form of technological ecology. Communication systems, planetary networks, and social structures had merged into a dynamic, self-adapting system that challenged every existing model of understanding. Nyong'o's research showed how the biomechanical interfaces developed during the mission could be adapted to create unprecedented forms of cross-species communication. The technology was less about control and more about mutual understanding. Ramirez's psychological frameworks suggested that conflict could be reimagined as a form of complex communication, a process of mutual discovery rather than destructive confrontation. The Blue Horizon team had done more than complete a military contract. They had provided a blueprint for a new approach to galactic interaction. Star systems that had been locked in centuries-long conflicts began to send diplomatic missions. Species that had viewed each other as irreconcilable enemies started to explore new models of interaction. Rodriguez understood the deeper implications. This wasn't about human superiority. It was about a fundamentally different approach to complexity, intelligence, and coexistence. The final report was less a military document and more a philosophical treatise. It suggested that humanity's greatest strength wasn't technological prowess or military might. It was an unprecedented capacity to recognize the potential for transformation in seemingly intractable situations. As the debriefing concluded, the holographic displays began to dissolve, leaving behind a fundamental question that would reshape galactic understanding. What happens when a species approaches conflict not as a problem to be solved, but as a conversation to be understood? Humanity had just begun to answer that question.